privatisation is ideological. Read the room, Ian. That's before we touch on any of the shadier practices of Thatcher. Thames Water is a company that supplies water to 15 million people in London and the southeast of England. And if you live in the UK, you have probably seen news headlines like this from the Metro on Thursday. With water supply a very much constant and consistent demand, decades of usage data, and with a captive market that has no choice in who provides their water, this should be an easy win for a private firm to exploit, right? All they need to do is keep the pipe network in good nick, plan for long-term changes in supply and demand, and try not to pump too much excreta into our waters, right? And yet, papers are reporting that Thames Water is in danger of going under due to it being £14 billion in debt. Coincidentally, former CEO Sarah Bentley resigned on Tuesday after recently coming under pressure over Thames Water's profligate dumping of sewage into British waterways, another reason why you may have seen Thames Water in the headlines of late. Thames Water's chairman, Ian Marchant, had this to say about what has clearly been a disastrous reign by most metrics. I want to thank Sarah for everything she has done since joining the company in 2020, building a first-class executive team and leading the first phase of the turnaround of the company. Read the room, Ian. The financial precarity of Thames Water has escalated to a point where concerns are being raised about the viability of the company, with experts questioning what is known as the gearing ratio of the company. Essentially, for our purposes, all we need to understand on this is that when adding up what Thames Water owns and what it owes in debt, the numbers don't look great. Ofwat, the regulatory body that is meant to ensure this sort of nonsense doesn't happen, recommends a 60% gearing ratio. However, Thames Water is currently at over 80%. That basically means that if Thames Water had a fiver, it owes £4 of it to other people, which leaves it vulnerable to sudden changes in the economic environment. Changes like a cost of living crisis, or a rapid rise in interest rates. Whoops. According to The Guardian, more than half of Thames Water's debt is inflation-linked, which means the cost of repaying their debts is increasing rapidly at the moment. But I mean, at least that debt was created to ensure that the pipe network was well maintained, sewage treatment plants were built to keep up with demand, and water leaks well managed. Right? No. Not at all, actually. Let's have a look at Thames Water's history to see if we can spot where it all went wrong. Thatcher. It's always bloody Thatcher, isn't it? I sound like a broken record, but genuinely, Thatcher and Reagan are responsible for birthing the mundane horrors of neoliberalism, which have seen us circling the drain for decades now. In this particular instance, Maggie was quite keen on the idea of privatising national utilities, taking the burden of responsibility away from the state and giving it to the free market for reasons we will go into in the next chapter. In 1989, Thatcher converted 10 regional state-owned water authorities into private entities, which were then left to be run by the wisdom of the free market, overseen by 3 regulatory bodies: the aforementioned Ofwat, DWI, who monitor the quality of our drinking water, and the Environment Agency, all of whom have done just a bang-up job. Thames Water was sold to RWE, a German utility firm, in 2001, who then themselves sold it on again in 2006 to Australian consortium Kemble Water Holdings, and then again to OMERS and the Kuwait Investment Authority in 2017. During this period, between 1990 and 2022, over £7 billion was paid out to shareholders, despite a suspiciously small amount of capital investment, despite increasing amounts of water volume being lost via leaky pipes, and despite increasing amounts of untreated sewage being pumped into our waters. In fact, in 2017, Thames Water was hit with a £20 million fine for discharging over 1 billion litres of untreated human waste into rivers and oceans, as per this from The Guardian. Thames Water has been hit with a record fine of £20.3 million after huge leaks of untreated sewage. The prolonged leaks led to serious impacts on residents, farmers and wildlife, killing birds and fish. The Environment Agency, which brought the prosecution, said the enormous volume of untreated sewage discharged was unprecedented, 1.4 billion litres, as was the length of time over which the discharges occurred. Despite it being a record fine, it was a puny amount when you consider that Thames Water had reported a £750 million profit the year before. So how has a company that has regularly recorded profits throughout this period ended up in £14 billion of debt? Well, let's look at this summary from Wikipedia. After capital investments, the business does not generate sufficient cash to fulfill its interest obligations. Thames Water has continuously issued more bonds in order to be able to service its debt. Also, bonds that have reached their maturity were repaid by the proceeds from issuing new bonds. Or in other words, they were borrowing more money to pay off existing debts. The article continues. Thames Water thus behaves similar to a country that continuously amasses more debt and only ever repays debt by issuing new debt, without ever actually reducing debt. Unlike countries, however, that justify increasing debt with a growing economy, Thames Water has no realistic chance to significantly increase its profits. Thames Water is thus in a dire and continuously worsening financial position, which ultimately needs to lead to a debt restructuring, as the interest and debt burden is untenable for the company. So what does this mean? It means that to ensure a key public service is maintained, the government will likely need to come in, take over the company, clear its debts, and get it into a place where it can continue to function. Or in other words, you and I are going to pay for the mismanagement of this company, for the dividends paid to shareholders, and for the loans they took out to enable them to misuse our public utility for the creation of profit. All whilst doing a horrible job at the very thing they were being paid to do. Jeez Louise, Thames Water seems like a really uniquely bad situation. At least the other 9 water services that were privatised are being run better, right? Right? So it seems that, like with our energy providers, railways and Royal Mail, privatisation has not only reduced the quality and provision of our services, but we end up paying more in the long run anyway. So why do we, in the UK, keep privatising stuff if it's so relentlessly crap? Can I please remind you that if you're enjoying this video, please take a second to give it a like. It tells YouTube that there might be something worth watching here and will help push it out to more people. Thank you. The belief in privatisation is ideological, and that is the most important thing to state when we begin talking about it. Essentially, it is grounded in the same belief system as the free market, and the belief that the competition inherent to a market leads to both efficiencies and lower prices for consumers. Stop laughing. Stay with me. If you have an established market with a healthy field of competitors and a functioning infrastructure, maybe. If you have multiple retailers to choose from, those retailers will be competing for your custom, offering a variety of prices, qualities and options in an attempt to capture your demand. And in an attempt to both be cheap enough to compete on price, but also make the maximum possible profit margin, they would need to become very efficient. Firstly, price mechanisms are vulnerable to tampering, whether through deliberate scarcity, as with things like oil and diamonds, or through aggressive use of capital to lower prices to the point where it destroys smaller competitors. Secondly, free market ideology may potentially work with toasters, TVs or trainers, or alliteration, but when dealing with necessities such as electricity, water and transport, it quickly becomes exploitative. A person needs food, water and electricity, and they have to pay for them regardless of the price. Which means if you were to apply the first point we just made and decide to restrict the supply of a resource in an attempt to extract a higher price out of the customer, there is very little a customer can do. In this scenario, a competitor can offer a cheaper price, of course, and steal your custom. But if supplier A increases their price by £10, supplier B can increase their price by $9.99, making themselves cheaper and getting your custom, but without much benefit to the consumer. That's before we touch on any of the shadier practices of price fixing, etc., but you get the idea. Lastly, capitalism has a tendency towards monopoly over time, as the bigger competitors consume their smaller counterparts, until you are left with only one or two options, which can then wield their capital over the market to dictate the price, rather than being informed by the price mechanism. I think someone wrote a book about that. The handy thing with necessities like water, though, is that we start in a monopoly, don't we? You pay your water bill to whoever owns that postcode, effectively. There is no choice, there is no competition, and therefore no incentive for lower pricing for the customer or for higher standards of service. Anyone that has seen my video on the profit motive can probably hazard a guess as to what happens when a private company is freed from the restrictions of pricing and maintaining high standards of work. Yeah, prices go up, as outlined in 2017 by the FT. Consumers in England are paying £2.3 billion more a year for their water and sewerage bills under the current privatised system than if the utility companies had remained in state ownership, according to research by the University of Greenwich. And what of the level of service we are getting for this additional cost? Well, according to this article in The Guardian last year, Thames Water leaked the largest volumes according to the industry body Water UK, losing 217 billion litres of water across the year. And what has our water regulator Ofwat done about it, you ask? Ofwat says the provisional and unverified 21-22 leakage volumes are at the lowest level since privatisation. Performance is still not good enough, and it will keep pushing the water companies. Over the last 20 years, we've imposed fines, penalties, and secured spending commitments totalling over £339 million specifically for failure on leakage, an Ofwat spokesperson said. This money has been used to improve performance, and where appropriate, money has been returned to customers at the expense of shareholders. Just a reminder then, that the shareholders who have been allegedly penalised for consistently poor performance have received £7 billion in dividends from just Thames Water alone, but have been fined £339 million. So that's all good, that's perfectly appropriate. That's a ratio of 1 to 20 in terms of fines to dividends, by the way, and that's just using Thames Water's dividends. And I haven't even got the time to look into the numbers on the raw sewage stuff that's ongoing. I mean, that's a whole video in its own right. What a mess. So who is privatisation for then, if it's such a bad deal for customers? As discussed already, over the 30 odd years since Thames Water was privatised, investors who can afford to lobby governments, who can remain unaccountable for any failings in the public utilities they are exploiting, and who can load up companies with debt, all whilst ensuring they are getting regular payouts. Privatisation works for them, because they can run services into the ground, exploiting every penny, knowing full well that no government will allow a necessity to collapse and will rush in to save it. That kind of safety net exists only for the rich. That kind of welfare state exists only for the privileged. Once again, a privately owned public service has soiled itself and expects the state to wipe its arse. And make no mistake, the government will do just that. It will take over, get it running well, and then it will sell it off again, like it did with the banks in 2008 and like it did with the East Coast Main Line, as per this from the London School of Economics in 2018. Despite its successful operation under public ownership, the East Coast franchise was re-privatised by the Conservative-led coalition government on ideological grounds in 2015. Its new operators, Stagecoach and Virgin, bid £3.3 billion for an 8-year franchise. The predicted revenue growth again failed to materialise, however, and after Stagecoach had lost around £200 million of its own funds and breached a financial covenant, Transport Secretary Chris Grayling renationalised the franchise until 2020. Who remembers Chris Grayling? Anyway, it is in the class interest of the investor class, a class that overlaps heavily with Parliament, by the way, to continue this cycle, to privatise exploitation and public-funded bailouts over and over again, with the services themselves getting weaker with each trip on the merry-go-round. Pressure is increasing on Labour to promise the renationalisation of water, but Starmer is waiting and hedging his bets as usual. Meanwhile, The Guardian today pointed out this from his favourite lieutenant. Last year, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, ditched the Labour Party's policy to nationalise water, saying to be spending billions of pounds on nationalising things, that just doesn't stack up against our fiscal rules. So, despite an overwhelming amount of national support for nationalisation of key industries, Labour continue to slither about and avoid making any decisions to help anyone, unless they think it will get them a few more votes at the election. I don't feel like the case for nationalisation of key industries can be made any better than by simply looking at the privatisation of those same industries. Public transport is famously a joke, with countless stories about train journeys that are more expensive than flights, or seeing bus timetables slashed to ribbons. I sure hope you don't miss the bus, because that's the only one coming today. Electricity and gas are currently priced so aggressively that they no longer bother to tell me when they want to increase my direct debit. I just wake up to discover they have taken another organ in the night. The downward spiral of the UK can be traced back to the mass privatisation of our necessities, and unlike so many of our journalistic class or comedy panel show centrists, I can remember the scorn that was lain at Jeremy Corbyn's feet when he dared suggest we reverse that trend. Or when the allegedly politically neutral BBC called his policy for a nationalised internet provider broadband communism and compared it in tone to nationalising sausages. The fact remains that natural monopolies do not work as privatised national services, even by capitalism's own criteria. And when talking of necessities, it is only right that the state takes ownership of these key resources, as only the state can prioritise the welfare of its people without the perverting influence of the profit motive. People's welfare should never be at the whims of shareholders and the investor class, and a democratic version of nationalisation is the only route to ensure that we do not end up repeatedly footing the bill for the greed of a shockingly small number of very rich people. Water is possibly the single most important resource we need, and it will become only more precarious and precious as climate change takes hold even further over the coming years. We cannot afford to leave our future in the hands of the private sector's vampires and ghouls. Let's permanently nationalise water, and let's do it now. Cheers for checking out this video. I really appreciate you taking the time to give it a watch, and hopefully you found it interesting, funny, or just useful. If that is the case, please give it a like, consider subscribing, and mention it to some friends maybe that might be interested in this topic. Nationalisation is such a key thing for this country to try and get right. Privatisation has done so much harm, and we just need to keep talking about it and keep applying that pressure, because all the polling suggests people do want nationalisation of key industries. Anyway, hopefully I'll see you again soon on another video, and until then, take care. Goodbye.